Hi there, welcome back to the Mindset Check podcast. I'm your host, Misha McKittrick. This is a podcast where we believe that as you take time for a mindset check, you have more power than you think you do. And where we also believe that in life you can become bitter or better inside of the choices you have around forgiveness. We'll get into that more today. It's so beautiful. It's exciting for me to have decided to share with you what I'm going to share with you today. Before we get into that, I want to make you aware of something that's really fun that I'm doing that's up and coming. I have been asked to speak at the Thriving Mom Summit, and this is an event that actually takes place online. There's 34 experts who come and create a message that's specific to moms to help them to find tools and strategies for more peace, productivity, and purpose. And this summit is completely free. What you can do is go and check out all of the different speakers and the ones that you think you'll resonate with, and then you can go listen to their presentation, and you'll also be able to talk to them live, which is a really cool addition. And you know how amazing technology makes it for us to be able to better ourselves, to do it even in the comfort of your own home. This event takes place October 17th through the 28th. And what they do is they place a few speakers every single day, and then you can listen to them all, or you can choose, the ones that you want to listen to. I will be speaking on October 24th, and I'll also be hosting a live event to be able to answer questions and just be live with anyone who wants to come. So if that's something that you're interested in, then you can click the link in the show notes, and all you need to do is register, and they'll be sending you all of the links and the things that you need to be able to join. Okay, so I hope you enjoy that free resource, and I'm so thrilled to be a part of bringing that to you. For anyone who is dropping in with us that's new today, I always try to just make sure that you know that you're dropping into a story, a chronological story. I'm reading my journal from when I am 15 and pregnant, and I go through a rocky road, some tough times, a rough relationship. My daughter passes away, and my husband at the time, at this point, he has been unfaithful and really into drugs, and it's a really complicated, messy story. But inside of that, what we find is little glimpses for the ways that we can learn about life, how we can check into life, the ways that we can take a mindset check to help us analyze what's going on in our lives. Because even though your lives are different than this, it's also the same, right? Because we're dealing with struggle. We're dealing with our internal conflicts and trying to figure out, how do we move forward from this, right? So how do we find light in the darkness, and how do we find joy in the struggle? And that's what this podcast is all about. So if you're here for the first time, we're thrilled to have you. You're welcome to drop into this episode, and you're also welcome to go back and listen to the rest of the story. In this episode, there's no one that is really new, though there might be some names that you haven't heard for a minute. So Gina and Paul are Jesse's sister and brother-in-law. Okay, they're married. And then Mary and Walter is Jesse's mom and stepdad. Okay, and then everybody else, my mom and dad, Shelly and April are my sisters. Everybody else should be pretty self-explanatory in the episode. Let's dive in. May 20th, 1995. Hello. Guess where we are? Newcastle fishing, and it is so nice. I've laid out, and now I'm just enjoying the day in the company. My dad, April, Walter, Mary, and Jesse and I. And I think Jesse has hit rock bottom. I think he realizes he has to be with Taylee again, and we are not getting a divorce. We are planning to be married in the temple next year. and I'm so excited. June 6, 1995. I hurt so bad for Taylee. My mom and April are in Salt Lake. My dad, Canada. Shelley, St. George. And Jesse had court and is on his way home. I'm alone. And I'm having a terrible time. I miss her so bad. Why can't I be with her? I would be happy to leave right now. I want to see her so bad. Hold her. Touch her. Kiss her. Hear her say mama, or just giggle and sing to her. Today, I took my photo albums to work and showed everyone because I am so dang proud. Plus, Jesse is not progressing with his smoking, and I wonder if his desire burns to be married and sealed to Taylee in the temple. I know mine does, and words can't explain how much I would love to do it. Jesse has been acting weird, trying to be an investigator, trying to find something out, anything. But I think it's because he's guilty. Why? I would probably not make it if he was, because I would divorce, and it would be so hard, especially right now. But I would rather find out now rather than later. I just have to be strong. Ugh, my eyes are burning. Taylee, baby, I love you. XOXOXO, mommy. So, I feel like obviously stating with, what is just absolutely like blaring. And that's the fact that like all of a sudden we're fishing, and it's only 6 days later from the last post, the last entry where I found out that he was involved in drugs on a level that I had never known, and he called from jail. 6 days after I wrote that entry is us going fishing and having a family picnic, and yeah. The one thing that I have to say around that is that sometimes when you're really trying to be sure and make big life decisions, it's a lot of yo-yo. It's a lot of going back and forth and really making sure. And so instead of looking at myself, looking back and, wondering, what the heck, girl, were you doing? I look back and say, I know exactly what I was doing. I was exhausting every last effort, and it is the one way that I can make sure that I did everything that I could. That yo-yo. Maybe you are in a yo-yo. Maybe you feel like that too. And we have to be careful not to make the yo-yo the pattern for our entire living, right? But I also feel like some of that, no matter what the circumstances in our life, allows us to be certain, allows us to be sure. So I kind of look back and I understand. Though I do know that he really had to be a little bit of a smooth talker to, suddenly be, it's a very complicated tapestry. But I guess from my angle, I'm happiest just knowing that I did hang on and exhaust all efforts. Not to where I was depleted. That's not that's not what I mean by exhausting all efforts. Just knowing that I really gave it what I had and what that's a really fine line for some people. For some people, exhausting all efforts, when they hear that, they might think, I pretty much have to have bloody knuckles and be like on my deathbed. And that's not the case either. So, using wisdom in that. I remember my dad giving me counsel during this time. And I think it was actually about 1 month after this happened. And I remember being in the basement of my parents' home, and we were really in the arena of having these family councils, especially with just my mom and my dad and my older sister, because they were all very in the loop and aware of what was going on. While I've said before, my younger sister was a lot younger, to be able to handle the heaviness of what was happening. But I remember in those circumstances, my dad giving me the advice and saying to me, Misha, make sure you write down in your journal how you feel when you are around him. Some of the best advice I've ever received. When we record the things that are happening in our life, it allows us to go back and look at those things so that we can be sure in times when we feel like we're unstable. Because a lot of times when we're going through really hard things, we can feel really unsure. And just collecting your feelings can validate you and help you feel stability. And then help you in making the decisions that are ahead of you. I also feel like the next entry, the June 6th entry, I was just at a point of really feeling low. No one was home. I was in a really hard spot. And, I could see that his commitment wasn't what I wanted it to be. He was definitely waffling, back and forth with saying that he was trying to do one thing and then doing a different thing. And then I write this line that says, I think it's because he's guilty. Why? Now, let's go through some of the things, because I tend to have this pattern of writing in my journal, and when I don't want to write something, maybe I'm afraid to kind of like write it in my journal, right? Because it's like the difference between writing something in sand and writing something in stone. Sometimes we need to write things and just rip it up. You know what I mean? And I definitely feel like I wrote clues sometimes instead of writing all of my feelings, because I was so fearful of the clue. So if you think through what he would be guilty of, you go to the cheating. I know about the cheating. You go to the drugs. I know about the drugs. What am I talking about that he would be guilty of? And I know, because I know my memory. And I had a listener say to me a while ago, she said she met me in public and she was telling me that she was listening to my podcast, and we were at the point where I had already recorded the episodes about Taylees passing. And she said, you skipped over something with her death. And there's something that, like the finding of her, and something you just skipped over. And she said, what happened? And I said to her at the time, I said, I'm really considering whether or not to share that. And as I have pondered it, I feel like it's the right thing to do. I feel like it's the right thing to share. Now, I remember when we went through and I said, I need to share the story. I just have this overwhelming feeling that I need to share the story as I experienced it. And now I feel like it is a good thing to share, and I hope with all of my heart that today you understand why. Because I am going to share information with you today about her passing and about this comment about him being guilty, okay? And I hope that you have it in your heart to receive it in the way that I'm intending. Because I go back to an event that I learned of when a little girl was run over by a member of her family, and her family all bonded together, and there was a lot of them. And they said, we're going to vow right now not to ever reveal what happened. And I remember I always really, really honored that, because I felt like that was the right thing to do for them. And it obviously resonated inside of my heart. And this part of the story of figuring out how she passed, I thought about the story of that family not sharing, the person who caused, that accident. Because if you hear nothing else in the rest of this episode, I hope that you hear that I do believe in my heart that it was an accident, and I don't feel like I need to be open and honest about this so that I tell my truth, or so that I feel whole and complete somehow with, facing my reality, because that was done many years ago. My aim and my purpose in sharing what I'm going to share with you today is simply to help you see that in life you have a choice to be bitter or better. That in life you have a choice to open your heart and to forgive people in your life, and the way that it affects you and the entire rest of your life and your living. So please, please, please hear this from that perspective. So it's interesting for me to hear myself even write this on June 6th, because what happened in my mind is I thought that I had blocked it out for 3 years. Okay? So it's interesting because we also get to dive into what our brain does with information. I wrote, that maybe he's guilty and that I probably wouldn't make it if he was, because I would divorce. And I write, it would be so hard, especially right now. And then I write, but I would rather find out now than later. So there's something looming that I kind of know, but like in my heart, I don't directly ask him or anyone else. We're not talking about it. There's not a talking about what happened. Okay. There is an event that happened after she passed. So she passed in January, and it was, maybe a week later that I received a phone call. And the phone call was from the police that first were on the scene when she passed away. And they said, we're sorry, but we need to ask you to reset up the scene because we forgot to take pictures. They called me a week after my daughter passed and asked me to reset the scene. And I remember with a lot of fire in my body that I said, you want me to relive the worst day of my life because you failed to do your job. And immediately that police officer said, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that I asked that. Please just forget it. And I was like, you're right. Like that was my feeling. And I hung up from that phone call. And I didn't allow my mind to think about why. And even if I did, and even if I was completely aware of the why, I didn't allow my mind to ponder on it. And then fast forward a few years, I was living in Phoenix, Arizona, and I was about a 7-hour drive away from my parents, from my family. And I went to something called The Forum by a company called Landmark Education. And it was a class or like a weekend course that I enrolled in at the advice of someone that I knew and trusted. And it was kind of a get complete with your life and an incredible platform for personal growth and to help you become aware of the blind spots in your life. And so I did this course over this weekend, and I had, near the end of the course, I had a realization of something that I had been blocking out for a very long time. And that was the actual cause of death for my little girl. The death certificate came back and said probable SIDS. And every time that someone asked me how she passed away, I didn't just say SIDS. I said probable SIDS. I think there was a huge part of me that knew deep down, but I don't think I knew how to handle or to deal with what the truth was. And so I had all of these memories flood my mind, and I realized that what had happened that night is that Jesse had put her, gotten up with her at night and had put her to bed, and he didn't want her to be cold, and he placed a blanket over her face. And she suffocated. And I remember the memory that came to me is that in the morning, Gina came into the room and couldn't see Taylee. And she was like, where is Taylee? And that was the memory that flooded when I started to put it together. And I also remembered the phone call with the police officer. That one also came. And so I began putting together puzzle pieces. And I started making phone calls. And I called Gina, Jesse's sister, and I said, what is this memory? What is this? And she said, Misha, are you serious? Because she didn't forget. And I was working through what all of this meant, right? Like all of a sudden, I find out that things happened differently. And what does that mean? And Gina said to me, Misha, that's why we felt like he went to jail, because he kind of had karma, And she's talking about later on in life, he'd gone to jail. And she said, because we feel like he never really got like punished or held accountable for that. And so they had kind of looked at it that way. That's the way that their brain, I say them, I'm talking about Gina and Paul. And I was kind of accepting all of these things that were happening and just trying to process them. And then as we were in that same conversation, she said he had gotten high that night. So I went to bed. He left with someone and went and got high and came home, and Taylee was waking up. And instead of her waking me up and then me discovering him, he gave her a bottle and took care of her and put her back to bed. And in his state, he was thinking, I'm going to do an action that would be good, like help her to be warm. That explains more clearly how the thought of putting a blanket over her could be a good thing. And so, talking to Gina, I got really clear on what had happened. And I was emotional and I was a wreck. After I got off the phone with Gina, I was left in a state. I remember being extremely confused. And I remember calling my coach that was assigned to me through the forum, and I remember that I got a lot of really good advice and instruction. And I remember really realizing that nothing had changed. Nothing in my world had really changed except the knowledge of how something happened. So it didn't actually change the event or the outcome. And I remember that was one of the things that we really walked through. And some of it is really blurry to me, okay? Some of the ideas or thoughts or the things that I walked to get to my outcome, okay? So I can remember being like, well, doesn't that mean that, and I just remember being in a tailspin. I remember reaching out to my parents and to my older sister and just making the unreasonable request that something really big is happening and could you please come? Could you please drop everything that you're doing? In the forum, you learn that you learn to make unreasonable requests of other people. And so I said, I know it's not reasonable or rational, but will you please come? Will you be here for my last session, and then we can be together to be able to hold this? And then I requested the same thing of Paul and Gina to come and to join us in this, what was happening. So I had made those requests, and a couple of days was going to be in between, me still processing this, and then the plan for us to kind of meet and have this powwow, kind of go over things. And so in the meantime, I was dealing with all of my confusion and all of my overwhelm and trying to be coached through it and be held in this container. And as I was doing that and putting everything together, it actually made it, for me, so much harder knowing that, it wasn't just that he put the blankets over her face. It wasn't just the memory that had been recalled, but the reality or the truth that came from Gina that he was actually high when all of that happened. And that that intensified it and really, made me kind of spin out and be like, but, and meanwhile, in the forum, in the way that my coach was, walking me through all of this, I remember learning and being taught so much of that curriculum is helping us see that we as humans walk through life wanting to make a lot of meaning. Like we make it mean something. And so for me, it was this platform where I was able to, because I had already been learning to take a step back in my life and to look at my life, by zooming out and really seeing the things that had happened in my life and what I made them mean. And it was inside of that I started to realize this truth. And then in learning about it, like I said, nothing had changed. Nothing about the outcome had changed. And here my brain was trying to make a meaning, right? Make meaning out of something that had happened. I love in the Four Sacred Secrets, there's a quote that says, "It is where we begin to realize that while the pain is in what actually happened, the suffering is in what we have made up as our story." One of the most advantageous things I've ever learned in my life is to learn the difference between what actually happened and the story. And so then I began trying to process it in a way that helped me to see it from what happened and that being separate from my story. Okay, because that part is really important, because sometimes what actually happens gets clouded by our story, by what we feel and think and want to bring to the table, because we want, whatever outcome we're hoping for, justification or, who knows, whatever it is, right? We want someone to take blame, whatever the case. And so it was inside of that container that I started to really go through what had happened. Okay. And so now I want to walk you through some of the things that I started to understand inside of that. Because I feel like that also helped me to make sense of it. I felt an overwhelming sense that it wasn't mine. She was my daughter. Yes, it happened to us. But the justice was not mine to deal with. And I was aware in very vivid ways that for me, I needed to trust that my God was a just God and that I needed to realize that it's not my place. It's not my place to carry out justice. Inside of that, I also knew in my heart and in my soul without any doubt that this is not something that he did on purpose. It's not something that he did maliciously, okay? And that I don't feel like my forgiveness would have been predicated on his intent, but I will say that I feel like that knowing that made it easier for me. I feel like I understood that I had an opportunity to become more understanding, more accepting, more trusting. And I could choose that, or I could become resentful and filled with anger and, kind of paint myself into a victim corner. And one of the things that I really, really felt aware of, so aware of, that just like I wrote in my journal, I don't think I could handle that right now. Our brain has such an interesting way of sort of protecting us, right? And sometimes it really stinks, and sometimes it actually really helps us and serves us. And I think my ability, or wherever that came from, if it was divine, if it was, instinctual to protect myself, I feel like me learning this later is exactly what I needed. I feel like I needed to go through what I was going through with Jesse and to get to an eventual outcome without this sort of clouding that, even though it did. And I'll talk to you more about that in a minute, about how. But I feel like I didn't need that to be part of my decision of whether I stayed or not, if that makes sense. And then I really feel like there was a poem that I knew about then, and you're probably insanely familiar with it because it's a really popular poem called Footprints in the Sand by Mary Stevenson. And I resonated so deeply with this poem. And it says, "One night I had a dream. I dreamed I was walking along the beach with the Lord, and across the sky flashed scenes from my life. For each scene, I noticed 2 sets of footprints. One belonged to me and the other to the Lord. When the last scene of my life flashed before me, I looked back at the footprints in the sand. I noticed that many times along the path of my life, there was only 1 set of footprints. I also noticed that it happened at the very lowest and saddest times in my life." This really bothered me, and I questioned the Lord about it. "Lord, you said that once I decided to follow you, you would walk with me all the way. But I have noticed that during my most troublesome times in life, there are only 1 set of footprints. I don't understand why in times when I needed you the most, you should leave me." The Lord replied, "My precious, precious child, I love you, and I would never, never leave you during your times of trial and suffering. When you saw only 1 set of footprints, it was then that I carried you." And I felt that to my core. I felt like I had been picked up and that this knowledge was able to leave me until a time when I would be able to handle it in the right way. And so for me, I could see it as a complete, just absolute blessing. I love this quote by C.S. Lewis. He said, "I think that if God forgives us, we must forgive ourselves. Otherwise, it is almost like setting up ourselves as a higher tribunal than Him." And I feel like that was my side of forgiveness as well, that it wasn't mine to figure out, because then I would be putting myself above Him. So I was working through all of that while my family and Gina and Paul were planning on coming to meet and have this powwow. And so when they came, they all got there the night of my graduation, and I think we maybe went to dinner, I'm not sure, but we went to this, graduation of this event that I had been doing for this course. And it was there that we had some time to kind of circle up, and I started walking them through what had happened. And it was short-lived. And so after that event, we all went to my apartment and we gathered in the living room and sat in a circle, and we all shared our parts, what we had remembered, different things that had happened to us. And Gina and Paul were completely aware the whole time, and kind of surprised that I wasn't, and also that there were other people that didn't know. My mom remembered, and my dad did not remember, and my sister Shelley was never, she never knew to, let it leave her mind. But this is the way that it went for my mom and my dad. My mom, that day, when we had come back to the house, a police officer visited the house. And he came. This is the part that I still to this day don't remember. It's almost like I can almost see it. And then it just leaves. Like they can't grab more of the memory, And I'm quite frankly fine with that. I think that's okay. So my mom, this police officer comes over, and Jesse and I walk into the bedroom with him, and he's wanting to kind of investigate and see how things were set up and just kind of observe. And my mom followed us into that bedroom, and Jesse was explaining to him how things were. She said I was kind of just watching, and that Jesse was explaining to him, her bedding and different things. And then my mom said she had to walk out of there. She had to leave. So she left, and she went, and she said, Elvin, come here, we need to go for a walk. And so she got my dad, and they went for a walk, and they talked about it. And my mom told him what had happened. She said that he was just in shock. He was just kind of didn't have a whole bunch to say. He was in shock. They went back to the house. She said they never spoke of it again. My mom had an experience where, a while after Taylee had passed and we'd had her funeral and maybe a couple of months had gone by, this night she told me of this experience where she had kind of been brooding, and she had felt, she had started to let hatred and anger enter her heart. And she remembers being in the bathtub one day, and the window was open in the bathroom, and she was just sitting there and being filled with these feelings. And she said a great big gust of wind came, and it was like the shower curtain just smacked her in the face. And she heard the words, "You need to stop that right now. You need to stop that. You need to stop worrying about blame. You need to stop worrying about all of this. You need to drop it and let it go." And so she did. And then when we were at this little powwow, that was her side of the story. My sister Shelley was, I talked to her recently about this, and she just said she was in just complete shock. Like she had no idea. She was just learning of it at that moment, and she just remembers being in shock. So that was all of our experiences. And my dad was like I was, just like, what? What? And so that is a little bit of a glimpse of how everybody in the story was handling it. Now, in between the time of me requesting them to come and me working through all of this and then them actually coming, I had a conversation with Jesse on the phone. And I remember, like right now sitting here, only bits and pieces of that conversation. But I do remember telling him that I forgave him, and I remember him feeling or saying that he didn't know if he could ever forgive himself. And, I wonder about him, even the way that shaped his life, the way that he was already kind of on that rocky path. And how much more did that lend to him being on that path? If you remember and you go back a few episodes, he had called me and told me that he'd been hooked on crystal meth since February. Well, February was just after she had passed away. And I think, right, that he needed a bigger way to numb. Because it was too much. It was too much. I wonder what had been different in the story if he had been able to talk about it. I'm sure that he was fearful because it felt like if he talked about it, that it was like admitting something really horrible that would cause legal action. And I have a lot of thoughts around that because I know that in his life he was doing a lot of things that I do feel like he should have been held accountable for. Okay, but I believe that when an accident happens, especially when it involves a parent, I believe that it all comes down to the condition of their heart with their intentions. And I feel like our justice system, our law, is really backwards when we forget about the person, And I understand that one of the hardest things is that it's really difficult to really tell the condition of someone's heart, But my heart feels really, really heavy for people who, accidents are going to happen, right? And the act was wrong, right? But the person wasn't wrong. Like, the person didn't do it from a place of wrong. And that's where I feel like if we could truly know someone's heart, I feel like we would be able to win more in these areas, right? And it feels heavy to me because I feel like when people make big mistakes without the intention of making the mistakes, that what's really needed is compassion and God. And I think about what it might have done for him to be criminally charged for this, And, oh man, I honestly don't know if it would have just felt like maybe even, it's a difficult thing for me to say because I'll tell you what I think. I think he punished himself more than he could have been punished. I witnessed him suffer even though, we didn't talk about it. I remember him laying on the bed one day, holding me in his arms and being completely tortured. Kind of rolling back and forth and just, saying things like, I'm so, so sorry, Misha, I'm so, so sorry. And then I remember another time, I just remember being on the side of a freeway and he was up on top of a billboard and I was laying in the field crying. I don't know. But I know that in that moment, he was feeling what he couldn't confront, what he couldn't talk about. I remember him kicking his car, like really losing it and just crying and like making dents in his car. Like I saw these things happen. And in my mind, I think I thought that it was grief. And yeah, it was grief, but it was a different kind of grief. It was overwhelming regret for a mistake he had made. And when I talked to my sister, Shelley, I feel like she said he suffered more than anyone could have made him suffer. Like he did that to himself. And so it's interesting for me because his life, the things that I know about his life have been hard. And I wonder, had we as a society or a community been able to respond to the person and take care of the person, what might have been different for him. I still think and believe that like our path would have I think we still would have been divorced. I think that was all like a really huge snowball of things, that were already in motion before Taylees' passing, But I think being able to be aware of all of those things helped me to say, what is the story or the meaning that I want to place behind this? Or more so, or even bigger, that I don't want to place around this. And I'm really happy that my mom ended up having the experience that she had, in being told to let it go. I think maybe she dropped it, maybe I don't know if she really let it go in her heart, if she truly, accepted and moved on at that point. But one thing that I know is that when we don't forgive, we're actually hurting ourselves more than we're hurting the other person, right? And I believe that if I would have attached a lot of meaning inside of this, that I would have ruined my life and the lives of others, like people around me. I think you might be familiar with the idea that if you're bit by a rattlesnake, which is better, to chase after the rattlesnake and get revenge and kill it, or to get the poison out. And there's a story about, like a folk tale about a guy who got bit by a poisonous snake. And there's a little twist on it where it says, all he could think about was how angry he was at the snake for biting him. He couldn't relax and thereby recall he'd been taught when he was young how to suck out the snake poison easily with his mouth to save his own life. His mind was too preoccupied with anger and self-pity, and the snake's poison killed him. And it's interesting to think that when we think of the first one, we think of just like going after the snake and getting revenge. Maybe we think like, well, I'm not doing that, and then are you really though getting the poison out? Are you really focused on that? Or is there still anger in your heart that's distracting you from taking the poison out? The Stanford University Forgiveness Project confirms the cardiac benefits of relinquishing anger and resentment. In their study, there were parents of children who had been killed in the Protestant Catholic violence in Ireland. And they took these parents through a course of learning how to let go of their bitterness and they were able to measure their physical status, and they were able to see that they had significant improvement. Forgiveness healed their hearts literally. They, through a series of the way that they study, were able to prove instantly that anger and resentment have a deleterious effect on the body, emotions, energy flow, and on the synchronization of the brain hemispheres. Anger kills the angry person, not the so-called enemy. That experiment was in the book Letting Go. Someone once said that hatred is like burning down your house to get rid of a rat. When we choose not to forgive, it's like that. The bitterness and resentment well up inside of us, and it deprives us of our peace. And it can cause health problems like high blood pressure and hypertension and weakened immune system and even cancer. I am such a fan of Dispenza's work, Dr. Joe Dispenza, and you'll hear me reference him like over and over. But he did a whole study on forgiveness and the emotional gravity that these situations create in our own biology. And he said, the stronger the emotional reaction to a person, problem, or experience, the more altered internally we can become. He says that when the event is threatening or painful, the brain actually freezes and takes a snapshot of the external event, okay? And the brain then captures a moment in time, and it's a moment which no longer exists. But in that process, that event can become neurologically embossed inside of our brain. In other words, it leaves a physical impression in our biology. Another way to say that is that it creates a long-term memory. Okay? And because the strength of the emotion is so big, it can create these stress chemicals in our body. And those can cause us to live in survival and to feel triggered. And then what happens is that because we don't like the way those chemicals feel, that can feel unpleasant, we end up doing whatever we can to avoid them. And when we're trying to avoid them, we actually keep reliving and revisiting the memory of the event over and over and over again, and we get stuck in a loop of thinking and feeling the very emotions that we don't want to feel. And that is how the conditioning process happens, how we can become conditioned or to create patterns in our life. And our body is so objective that it doesn't know the difference between the actual experience, the one that actually created the emotion, or the brain's memory that's creating that emotion over and over again. So when we do this over and over again, we are wiring our brain in like the neural pathways of our brain. And we're creating it to be more automatic the next time, to be able to feel and remember the painful past. So then what happens is our perception of the world becomes clouded or based on that memory, okay, those memories. And that is what keeps the body connected to the past. So we will continue to see the world equal to the story that we're telling ourselves about the past. And so by doing that, you give away your power. You give away your power to energy that you never wanted in the first place. But the good news is that we can do something about those uncomfortable feelings and those emotions, and we can bring our body back to the safety of the present moment. And every single time that you do this, Joe Dispenza talks about it like you lower the volume to those emotions and those thoughts. Okay, so we're turning it down. You're telling your body that it's no longer in charge. And now, by being in charge, you get to choose. And so the way that that actually happens is that when you are sitting, like in a quiet moment with yourself, or if you're in meditation, instead of going into those uncomfortable feelings, or anytime you notice that you're slipping into those uncomfortable feelings, what you actually do is start to pay attention to the things around you. Okay, you can do it with your eyes closed, eyes open, whatever. You start to notice the smells, the sounds, the feeling of like the ground next to you, the chair, the textures, maybe your clothing. You start to help your body understand, I'm in a different place. You're trying to recall that and to bring back all those emotions, but I'm in a different place. And that's how you turn the volume down, is by doing that over and over again. And when you do that enough times, you're no longer ruled by the negative emotions, okay? The ones that keep you in a space of not being able to forgive, to move on. And when you do that and you find freedom from the emotional charge that you've always been living with inside of this event, inside of your life, inside of your mind, inside of your reality, like what's real for you, and you start to let go of those things, you're left in a space of being able to see a lesson learned. You're left in a place of being able to find the wisdom inside of it. And that is beautiful. Henry Ward Beecher said, "I can forgive, but I cannot forget is only another way of saying, I will not forgive. Forgiveness ought to be like a canceled note, torn in two and burned up, so that it can never be shown against one." Frank Clark said, "You haven't really forgiven a fellow until you've forgotten that you've forgiven him." Beautiful, right? It's gorgeous. It makes me feel so happy when I have holes in my memory of the act of forgiving. Like knowing that it went down and that it happened. It's kind of spotty. It's great. And then I get to actually choose the feelings that I want in place. Or, it's kind of, there's a quote that says, "If it's our nature to criticize or demean, we can cause the voices of gladness to be silenced." And when we're more focused on the negative feelings that come with not forgiving, like, we're making a trade. We're making a trade when other feelings can be felt in those moments to actually help us to live a better life. By hanging on to those, that's your gratification. That's your payoff. Like you getting to hold on to those, is actually really in the way of you being able to have freedom and living a much better life. I like the story of the monkeys in the Four Sacred Secrets. It says, in rural India, the villagers have a smart but simple method for catching the burly, mischievous monkeys that come to steal from homes. They leave some aromatic and juicy desserts in a tiny hollow of a tree. The excited monkey squeezes its hand through the hole, but the opening is too small for it to withdraw its closed fist with the dessert inside of it. The monkey has become far too attached to the dessert to let go, and the monkey catchers swoop right in and relocate the monkey to a jungle away from civilization. That's what it's like to hold on to hurt and disappointment. No matter how justified we may feel in clinging to our suffering states, each of us must ask ourselves, what's more important, holding on to our hurts or nurturing our relationships? I feel like That's a beautiful representation of sometimes what we do when we don't want to let go and we're trapping ourselves. A lot of times when we have trouble forgiving other people, we're also having trouble forgiving ourselves over things. It's difficult to be able to treat people outside of you differently than you can treat yourself. And other times we might be afraid of forgiving because we're afraid of looking foolish. And I guess sometimes when we're in those states, it's really good to remind ourselves that forgiveness is a lot about our own health and about our own well-being and about our ability for what we can then offer ourselves in ways that we can show up in this life. And then once we can get to that point and accept that, I think it's important to then be able to look at it from a completely different angle. And that angle is that when we are forgiving because of those reasons, those are actually selfish reasons. Like, it's great that it got you from, that tight clenched fist, that tight clenched monkey fist and being trapped into being able to gently take that hand out of the hole and to be able to move into a state of forgiveness, even for selfish reasons. But then realizing that that vibration or that energy won't completely heal us, right? Because that is a state of selfishness, and that's entirely different than approaching it with compassion and love and trying to understand the other person and having their interests in mind and what can contribute to making them a better person. Like in the story Les Miserables, when he stays at the house of the priest and then he ends up getting caught because he stole a bunch of things in the morning, and then the priest just says, I gave it to him. I gave it to him. And he did that because that was in the best interest of that man and of his becoming, right? He was trying to help him have a fresh start in life, and it was such a beautiful example of forgiveness. When we are vibrating in a high vibration or a beautiful state or connected to truly spirit, right? In our best and most spiritual states, it really is impossible to turn a blind eye to another's well-being. Sometimes it's not about fairness. Sometimes it's not about morality or any kind of law. It's about the well-being of the person. And I agree that there is definitely times when someone's heart is not in the right place, and to get them there, there's actions, legal actions and things that need to happen. But I sure wish that we had a heart detector test. I wish we had the ability to know what's really in their heart. There's times when forgiveness is extended and their heart isn't even in the right place, but because forgiveness was extended, it changed their heart. I like the quote that says, forgiveness is needed precisely because the person did something wrong that cannot be excused. And faults are thick when love is thin. I think ultimately with Taylee and the reassurance that I was able to check into at the time of her passing, it was how much I had known and learned and believed that it was her time to go. And that the way she went would not have changed whether or not she left. And I believe that with all of my heart. And I think that that was all supposed to be part of my story. And when we do that and we can pick up our own life stories, we learn from them, we gain stability from them, Charles Fillmore said, "It's through our forgiveness that true spiritual healing is accomplished." And so much of this story contributes to the mantra that I live by that says, what matters in life is not what happens. What matters is what you think about what happens. There's a song by Bradley Cooper that says, maybe it's time to let the old ways die. Maybe it's time for you to clear space in your life to allow feelings to exist in the space of negative ones. Just because you forgive someone doesn't mean that you can't have a boundary. Okay? It doesn't mean that you can't protect yourself or learn and know better for next time. When we forgive someone, we're not saying that what they did was okay. We're not overlooking their behavior. It's the opposite. When we forgive someone, we see the horrible thing that they did in all of its ugliness, and we choose not to hold that against them. I hope with all of my heart that me sharing these truths with you help you to see something different in your life. Because for me, even to this day, when people ask me how Taylee passed, I still say probable SIDS. And there's a reason for that. The reason is because it's a really big story. And you have to take some time to dive into it and to truly understand. And a lot of times when people are asking that, they don't have the capacity to sit with me and to understand. And so if you're ever walking with me and you're talking with me about her and I tell you probable SIDS, you can just look at me and say, I know. You know? Because it's a big story. And for me, I don't have malice in the purpose of me needing to say, all of the truth, truly, behind it. Because if I say that superficially, if I say, actually, and I go into what happened, wow, that's a different feeling than understanding with compassion and love how everything really went down. How in my heart, I hope that Jesse can learn to forgive himself. That he can truly understand that God knows the intents of his heart. And that is the most important thing. And with that, I hope that you see that no matter how big the things are in your life, the way that you handle them, you have more power than you think you do. If you loved this episode, I hope that you'll share it with someone, send it to someone. And if you are getting a lot from this podcast, I would want to kiss your face, love you. If you just go write a review and, leave a 5-star review if you love it that much. And also write a review, write a few sentences, because that helps the algorithm in wanting to suggest our show more. So thank you so much for dropping in with us. I really am so impressed with this audience and the people who are listening, and how I was with a woman today who I learned that she, has been going through a lot in her life, and I haven't talked to her for years. And she said, I listened to your podcast and just let it all go. She just takes the deep breaths and gets in the bathtub and cries and tries to just process it all. And it's moments like that for me that are so rewarding. So thanks for sharing. And thank you so much for being the kind of person that you are, to want to step into a space where it's of high importance to you to work on who you are, who you're showing up as in this world. And with that, I'll leave you a quote that says, "For our own good, we need the moral courage to forgive and to ask forgiveness. Never is the soul nobler and more courageous than when we forgive. This includes forgiving ourselves." That's Dieter Uchtdorf. Until next time, my friends.